Fora TV. The world is thinking.
My name is Chase Robbins, and I'm the Provost of the Graduate Center. The Graduate Center is one of the constituent parts of the City University of New York, and it is a hub of advanced research, teaching, and public programming here in Midtown. It is unique, I think, in higher education, both nationally and internationally, in its commitment to PhD training in the social sciences and humanities, for example. Along with Berkeley, University of Texas at Austin, UCLA, and Columbia, we grant the largest number of PhDs in the world. We have some 34 doctoral programs and 31 or so research centers, and as I said, we're also a hub of public programming, and it is in that spirit that I have the great pleasure of introducing tonight's event, one of our public programs. In fact, tonight we inaugurate a new series, which is called Perspectives, Conversations on Policy and Place with Peter Beinart. The Perspectives series features thinkers and practitioners who will be examining some of the most pressing political and public policy issues shaping our world. Tonight, our distinguished panelists will explore the topic, Is Obama's Foreign Policy Working? I hope you'll join us in further meetings November 8th, when Tina Brown, Andrew Sullivan, and Jeff Jarvis will discuss the future of the media. Perspectives is made possible by the generous support of the Hertog Foundation, and it's also co-sponsored by the Graduate School of Journalism and the Writing Politics specialization in the Graduate Center. So tonight we're delighted to welcome to our stage two guests. First, journalist, author, and critic Christopher Hitchens. Mr. Hitchens is the author of numerous books, including Letters to a Young Contrarian, Why Orwell Matters, God is Not Great, and most recently his memoir, Hitch 22. A regular contributor to Vanity Fair, The Atlantic Monthly, and Slate. He's also written and presented a number of documentaries for British television. In 2005, and I'm sure he's heard this more times than he'd like, he was named one of the world's top 100 public intellectuals by Foreign Policy and Prospect magazine. We also have the pleasure of featuring George Packer. Mr. Packer became a staff writer for The New Yorker in 2003 and has covered the Iraq War for the magazine. His book, The Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq, was named one of the 10 best books of 2005 by the New York Times. As a historian of 7th century conquest and colonization in the Middle East, I learned a great deal from his account of 21st century conquest and colonization in the Middle East. Plus ça change was one of my impressions. Packer is also the author of several other books, including Blood of the Liberals, Central Square, and most recently, Interesting Times, Writings from a Turbulent Decade. He's contributed numerous articles, essays, and reviews on foreign affairs, American politics, and literature, to a variety of publications, and he's also taught writing at Harvard, Bennington, and Columbia. Our discussion will be moderated by Peter Beinart, who was instrumental in organizing and producing the program, and we are all grateful to Peter for having done that. It's a great pleasure to have Mr. Beinart amongst us. Mr. Beinart is a Schwartz Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation, and he's also Associate Professor of Journalism and Political Science at CUNY's Graduate Center and the Graduate School of Journalism. He's also Senior Political Writer for the Daily Beast, a contributor to Time, and the author of two books, The Good Fight, Why Liberals and Only Liberals Can Win the War on Terror, and Make America Great Again, and The Icarus Syndrome, A History of American Hubris, just published in June of 2010. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to our participants so that we can begin.
Thank you. Well, it's my great privilege to be sitting here with two of the writers in the United States who I admire the most. And let me start it off to you, Christopher, by asking you whether you think any defining theme or themes have emerged in President Obama's foreign policy in the 18 months or so since he's been in office.
The word theme is a standing temptation to a certain kind of panelists, of whom I'm one, because it has to, and perhaps to a certain kind of person who attends this sort of event too, who may be about to guess what I'm about to allude to. Because it irresistibly puts one in mind of a remark made by Sir Winston Churchill when presented with a rather soggy, elaborate dessert, and investigating it for a bit with his spoon and then waving it away, said with the words, "Take away this pudding, it has no theme." Nothing quite as dank and depressing as a themeless pud. In order for the question before us to be answered rigorously, which I hope we'll put our minds to, you'd have to have some kind of empirical or theoretical standard for judging its success. In other words, you'd have to know what it was, to know what its attainments purported or intended were supposed to be. I think that presents one with a difficulty right away. There's one thing one can say for sure about the policy is that it's quite considerably based on, and quite deliberately based on, what I would call atmospherics, not intending to diminish it by saying that, but on the view of what would perhaps otherwise have been called, if the phraseology hadn't already been annexed, the possibility of a kinder, gentler United States. I mean, I don't think anyone would dissent from the view that you can tell that in everything the president says when he's traveling or receiving foreign guests, or as today, I haven't notice of his speech, but his address to the United Nations. If it's today or tomorrow, I'm not sure. And everybody, I think, understands why that's thought to be a good thing. That the idea of an overbearing, partly insular and partly interventionist America, that awful Texan paradox, as some people think of it. People who don't really know much about the outside world but have very, very strong opinions about it. Which used to terrify me when I was a young man living in England, and I don't forget how it felt either, the LBJ period. Okay, so we could start. Shall I start by reviewing briefly that?
Please.
You don't want me to go on for too long, I'm sure, but well, I think it's already hit diminishing returns. Shall I just say? The oldest test in diplomacy is simply this. Who are your friends? Who are your enemies? Do they know that they are? And is it more dangerous to be your friend than your enemy? Or is it more dangerous to be your enemy than your friend? Are your enemies apprehensive? Are your friends rewarded? Now, in his various attempts to make nice, as we used to say, with the Arab and Muslim world, I think the president's probably played out the string as far as he can. I don't think anyone accuses him of being on any kind of crusade. It's certainly no lineaments of a crusade are visible in any respect. But I'll give you an example of what I mean by the limits of this, which was a speech he made, which I thought was a good idea in itself, in, I think it was January of the year before last, at any rate on the Iranian Nowruz, the new year as celebrated in Persia. And he spoke directly, as a lot of us had recommended that he did, to the Iranian people. We can do this. The Iranians are not like the Iraqis or the North Koreans. They have access to outside world information, and many of them have relatives overseas. And he said, you know, we want the Islamic Republic to rejoin the family of nations. Well, let's make that a test statement and interrogate it a little bit. Why is Iran not in the family of nations to begin with? Because it's an Islamic Republic, would be my answer at any rate. A strong case could be made. It's its nature as a dictatorial, theocratic regime that commits it first to a policy of atrocity towards its own population, and second towards a very aggressive posture towards Lebanon, to a degree Afghanistan, and to, well, we have evidence of Iranian complicity in acts of extreme violence, up to and including assassination and bombing in as far away as Buenos Aires, as daringly as in Berlin and Vienna, trying to destroy the Kurdish leadership in those two places, issuing death threats against novelists living in England, and other things of this kind, and staking what looks like its entire credibility on negating the concept of non-proliferation. It must mean a lot to them because they could certainly get a great deal of aid, acceptance, trade, prosperity, and stability if they would give up the idea of their own nuclear device, but though they have promised every possible authority, the International Atomic Energy Authority, the European Union, the United Nations, all other interlocutors, not the United States directly this time, that they're not doing so, they've been caught cheating, and we know that that's what they do want. So that has to be, I think, taken very ominously and very seriously. Is there someone in this room who knows what Obama's policy towards that is? And that's exactly what I feared. Well, I live in Washington, D.C. I have advantages that some of you don't possess. I can call around and ask the administration, who in the administration speaks on Iran? Who decides policy? Where is it? Not at all easy to find out. How is it determined? Who's the spokesman for it? Who's the go-to person? We don't know. I sort of wish we did. This brings me to a second point, then probably I should stop, because if I hadn't made the point by now, I wouldn't have succeeded in carrying it at all. Second point, which again, colloquially to put it, is the question of how many cooks should be involved in the making of foreign policy. And clearly Obama doesn't want to be a foreign policy president. That's been made very clear by the accounts some of you will already have read of Mr. Woodward's latest account of decision-making on Afghanistan within the administration. It's even clearer than I thought that Obama wishes not to be a foreign policy president at all, if he can avoid it, and certainly not an overweening dictating one, any more than he wishes to be dictated to, I might say in fairness, by the Joint Chiefs of Staff or by the Defense Department in general. But if you ask, all right, in the war that he has made his own, very reluctantly, the one in Afghanistan, who's in charge here? Who's in charge of the clattering train? You have himself, who made the ultimate decision, very much against his own will and judgment, and thus to be very much considered in dubiety, in a way. Second, his Secretary of State. Third, his anointed general, Petraeus, and before that, another anointed general, McChrystal. And I don't think we should forget him, and I know he wouldn't want us to, Richard Holbrooke. All of these people are supposed in some way to be responsible for the AFPAC dimension. And we don't know which one of them really is in command, or what it is they would count as a victory or a defeat. But I will just close on saying this, because it's it's such a big lacuna that I have to draw attention to it now, and I want us to come back to it. In McChrystal's first long layout of American purpose in Afghanistan and the Pakistan dimension, before we discovered quite the extent to which we have been fooled by our Pakistani client, ally, manipulator, whatever designation you choose to give it. General McChrystal put in so many words the ambition that American policy be directed to limiting the influence of India in the Hindu Kush and the Khyber regions. I thought that should have had a much more solid debate, especially among Democrats and liberals, than it has had. Because it seems to me that the importance of India, fantastically neglected by our press, by our think tanks, by our academy, and by our foreign policy professionals, is very salient, and that a policy that doesn't include any consideration of it is very unlikely to succeed. India is, like us, very large, hard-fought and hard-won, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural democracy. It has a free economy, or the beginnings of one. It's important as a counterweight to China. It's been fighting against Al-Qaeda and its surrogates for a long time longer than we have. It was supporting the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan long before George Bush did. And to leave it out of account in this way, or even to treat it as a problematic country, a possible enemy country, rather than as a possibly, or actually very, very important friend, ally, and keystone state for the United States, seems to me to symbolize confusion and weakness and shortage of vision in the making of our president's foreign policy. So that's my opening thought.
You've got us off to a good start. George, it sounds to me that Christopher is suggesting that the defining theme of the Obama foreign policy is spinelessness, not just intellectual incoherence, not just the difficulty in actually, in his words, deciding who is our friend and who's our foe, but an unwillingness to actually take the hard moral decisions that would be required to actually do something about that. about that. And I wonder if you think he's being too harsh.
I actually didn't hear so much of the latter in what Christopher said. I think that his focus was on focuslessness and on the softness of the pudding of our foreign policy. Although in the particulars that you mentioned, Christopher, yes, there was a sense of being afraid to call a spade and to see our friends and our enemies as they are. I think Obama went into office actually not wanting not to be a foreign policy president, but wanting to have it be kept within certain bounds that it was probably unrealistic of him to expect. His idea basically was, without saying this, and this is a problem, because if you can't lay it out honestly, then people are going to begin to wonder what holds it all together. He was going to move us away from a foreign policy where terror and the threat of terror was the really all-defining issue, and where everything fell into place in relation to that threat. And instead, being kinder and gentler, giving speeches in Cairo to the Islamic world, in Accra to the underdeveloped world, in Oslo to Europe. He was going to, and with his efforts in Copenhagen and in Prague on non-proliferation, he was going to move us toward renewed partnerships embedded in international institutions. These dreaded words, because they really do make your brain fall asleep as soon as you start to hear them or say them, to solve large problems: global warming, poverty, nuclear weapons. And he would be a non-wartime president. I think that was his idea. And what's happened is that the hardness of the world has pulled him away from what he wanted. I mean, the overwhelming issue of his presidency and foreign policy has been the war in Afghanistan. I think Christopher is absolutely right. This is not a war that Obama wants to be fighting. This is left over from that era when terror was the all-defining issue. And in a kind of one-eyed way, he has stumbled deeper into it, sent a lot of mixed signals in a lot of directions, and ensured that there will be confusion on all sides next July 2011. The Pakistanis and the Afghans take the withdrawal deadline as a sign that we're on our way out. Petraeus and the military apparently don't think it means anything. Liberal Democrats are kind of hoping it means there will be a serious move toward withdrawal. Conservative Republicans are waiting for that moment to bring out the long knives. And that's something we should talk about, is the effect of domestic politics on our foreign policy, because that's everywhere important. So I think he has been unable to achieve or even to spend time on what he thinks are the really important issues, with the war on terror as a kind of secondary, steady state. We can live with it, accepting a certain degree of risk, acknowledging that Al-Qaeda is much diminished. Instead, he is consumed with a war that is all about Al-Qaeda. And I would agree with Christopher, if this was your point, and I'm not sure it is, but I think you think this, that in his desire to move our foreign policy into a new era, he has made a big mistake in downgrading the importance of democracy. He had, I think, it was essential in some ways to disinfect the bad odor that the Bush administration left in the air with its use of that language. I mean, the second inaugural of Bush did more to damage, I would say, the cause of human rights and democracy than any speech ever given by Richard Nixon, because it promised things that we had no intention of delivering. It was a megalomaniacal commitment to support any movement anywhere on earth that was going to, that was...
Pay any price, bear any burden.
Yeah, it was Kennedy-esque, beyond Kennedy-esque. Kennedy himself fell pretty far short of that. But Bush, I mean, within a few months, it was clear that on Egypt, for example, we had no intention of living up to it. So Obama, I think, knew that he had to watch out for that. But when you put democracy in the 48th paragraph of every speech, which is what Obama does, and Hillary Clinton does the same, when your foreign policy is defined by the 3 Ds, and they are development, diplomacy, and defense, and there is no 4th D, democracy, I think you're simply taking away a pillar of our strength and an essential value of our foreign policy. And he's done it in a way that seems needless and short-sighted. Iran, I mean, we'll have to talk about Iran. I don't sense that he's been quite so wrong-headed. I think he may have thought he was going to cut a deal, but he may well have thought he couldn't. But at any rate, by offering a deal, I think he has put Iran on the defensive in a way it was not in 2006 or 7 or 8. Remember the situation back then. We didn't know what Bush's policy was any more than we know Obama's as far as a strike against the nuclear facilities. It was subject of speculation in the New Yorker and other magazines, but no one really knew what Bush was going to do. There was a period when people actually thought, we're going to go to war with Iran. It didn't happen. I think it's almost impossible to think Obama would, but what he has done is he's isolated Iran. Iran is no longer, and Ahmadinejad, partly because of domestic politics in Iran, is no longer a swaggering, rising force. And I think the sanctions are an achievement that have to be acknowledged, and that were only possible because we at first feinted toward engagement or made a move toward engagement that was rejected by Iran. I think that was the right thing to do. And Russia and China, which were adamantly opposed 2 years ago, are now more or less on board. So I think that's a place where kinder and gentler was also shrewder. But my main point is the world as it is has prevented Obama, and I think his own lack of focus has prevented him from having the foreign policy that he wanted to have.
Well, let's.
Can I just say something
Please.
directly, just on George's closing points on Iran? I more or less agree, and I wanted to add to the irresponsibility of the Bush posture on these things. There was a time in Washington where you could ask people in the administration, what's the line on Iran? And you could tell it was a line of the day because they'd all say it in the same way, same words, same tone of voice, same portentous expression if you were actually talking to them. And it was this: we will not leave this problem to be dealt with by the next administration.
Right.
A very meaning remark,
Yeah.
right? And a fantastically irresponsible one. And it expressed also their own feeling of acidulation. All the Republicans felt, I think correctly, that they'd been left the horrible gift of Saddam's Iraq, which Clinton and Gore repeatedly said they would take care of, and passed an act through House and Senate swearing to take care of, to change the government in Iraq. They felt that because of Clinton's dithering, they'd been gifted that. They weren't going to commit this. That's exactly what they have done. And at least Obama hasn't gone around saying something pseudo-meaningful, at least apparently threatening and minatory, but was actually empty, like that.
I wanted to go back to, before maybe we delve into some of the specific country-to-country issues, some of the themes that came out in what you said, and particularly, George, what you said at the beginning, which is that essentially one of the efforts of the Obama presidency, although he hasn't been willing to say it publicly quite for domestic political reasons, is to downsize the role that terror and fear of terror plays in American foreign policy, based on the idea that many people exaggerated the threat. That we've now learned that it's not as much of a threat. It can be lived with. It should not be the driver of our foreign policy. And I wanted to ask you, Christopher, A, do you think that's true as a statement about what Obama and people around him believe? And if so, do you think they're right?
Well, again, to revert to the reports I was reading this morning from Bob Woodward's account, these are in quotation marks too, I mean, which is sometimes suggestive with him. Obama seems to have said, look, it's not so bad. We lost 2 big towers in New York and we're still here, in fact, stronger than ever. As a matter of fact, I have quite a lot of sympathy with that. If you say you're in a war on terror, you can't simultaneously promise people that they'll be
No casualties
secure
at
every
home.
time they get on a plane, or you'd expect to be losing people all the time. And it's pathetic to try and square that circle. And indeed, these people are not very skillful, not very well organized. What they want is literally impossible, the restoration of the caliphate. They can't get it. Even if everyone voted for it, they couldn't have it. It's the most reactionary dream nightmare, actually, that's possible to imagine. And yes, of course, terror talk can be used to obliterate intelligent discussion, which is what I think was at the back of his mind all the time. It's a stopper on debate. It's a means of shutting people up, intimidating dissent. So I feel pretty sure I understand what he means by that. That said, I think too many things have come to him as a surprise. I mean, the very rapid declension of the state of affairs in Yemen, for instance, which I know people were warning him about. Very rapid declension of events in Somalia, not so much of a surprise, but really terrifying. Things of this kind. I don't like it when I see people in the State Department, when asked for comment, looking blank, as if they're only thinking about it now for the first time. And pay them to have thought about it a bit earlier than that. One wants to approve of the decision to take the word Islamic out of the discussion about terror, as if terror was generic. It could have been coming from really, really, really horrible Adventists in Nepal or something. And so jihad and Islamic terror, as with the domestic discussion, as far as possible, leach all that out. That's not going to work. And indeed, probably the next series of attacks that we will experience in this country will be from people who probably were born here or came as young people. And he hasn't, I think, prepared public opinion for that very well. And the Iranian question, sorry, once more on this. Hillary Clinton made what I thought was a very good speech the other day. It was at the Doha summit. Thus, you can date it, a matter of 8 months or so ago. She said to I suppose the plenipotentiaries are largely of the Sunni Muslim and Arab world, but beyond as well, Malaysia and Indonesia. This is what we think has happened in Iran. There's been a coup, a military coup by the Revolutionary Guards, which has robbed some of the existing religious authorities of their power, and possibly Ahmadinejad of some of his too. And it's very much narrowed and diminished the power-wielding forces. They're very much more concentrated now and very much more ruthless. She could have added, and I think should have done, the people who've done this to Iran, imposed this very horrifying dictatorship, are also the people who have the private ownership of the illegal nuclear weapons. In other words, if you're talking about how to confront this, well, the people responsible for both the things we're worried about just identified themselves as the same, yep. And at the cost of very much isolating themselves within their own country and in the region beyond. I mean, I'm sure all of you have seen the video of the ambassador of Bahrain, or was it the United Arab Emirates?
Which
could have
video
been
are you
either.
talking
Said he was
about?
supportive of military action.
Talking in Aspen
Yeah.
to our friend Jeff Gilbert, saying, look, we don't. I've heard Arab diplomats say this in private frequently in Washington, but never seen one say it like this in public. What are you waiting for? Mm-hmm. Our lives are unbearable. The idea of living with an Iranian nuclear blackmail regime is intolerable to us. Don't you realize? Mm-hmm. Now, the reason I emphasize this is, apart from its amazing disclosure value and shock value, is this. What is the objective of the administration? The one we were just discussing. To, as far as possible, moderate the tempo of conversation about one of the world's great religions, shall we call it, Islam to be exact. Well, here we have Muslim governments, and peoples too, begging for protection against a Shia theocracy. Now, people who want to change the tempo of our conversation with Islam, surely ought to be ready to take some advantage of that fact. And they don't seem to be able to.
I do think that the administration thinks that the threat was exaggerated. I know for a fact that people in the White House think the Christmas Day bombing, for example, the bungled underwear bombing, was ludicrously inflated by the press and by, going back to my earlier point, the Republican Party, to the point where Obama had to appear before the microphones over and over, and DHS had to, re-examine all of its practice, et cetera. That was a thwarted bombing. But it's easy to say that now, and I think they're right. But what I think that if, by chance, by some incredible miracle of organizational prowess, which they don't seem to have, Al-Qaeda was able to kill 20,000 people in an American city, then I might think, that was not such an inflated fear. But at the moment, looking back on the last decade, David Kilcullen, the counterterror and counterinsurgency expert, said the real problem was not the anarchists themselves in the late 19th and early 20th century and the number of people they could kill, which was in the several thousands. It was the reaction that they were going to produce, which ended up being World War I. And I think it's a reasonable narrative of the last 10 years that has been Al-Qaeda's greatest success, is the reaction it's elicited. Back to Iran for 1 second. I think the key question is, what is the nature of that regime? Is it basically the Soviet Union? Mm-hmm. Or is it something closer to Hezbollah? Ray Taki, who was one of the hidden policy guys on Iran until he left Dennis Ross's office in the first year, recently wrote a piece saying basically it's closer to the latter. And Ray Taki was an engagement guy. I mean, he was a strong force for engagement. So he's saying they're basically driven by millenarian, apocalyptic ideologies that are not entirely self-preserving, that could lead to self-destruction. There's others who argue that this is basically a regime that wants to survive in power. And the last 30 years have shown that that's what essentially motivates it, including the willingness to turn guns on its own people. In fact, to do more than that. So the question of policy toward Iran comes down to the question of the nature of the regime, I think. And I don't know the answer. I don't think the White House knows the answer, because our information about it is pretty bad. Mm-hmm. That's a big problem. For 30 years, we've been in darkness on Iran.
And indeed, you could say, and people do, Thanasis Kambanis' very interesting new book on Hezbollah seems to argue that Hezbollah is not just a millenarian, apocalyptic group either, or not just.
Right.
But is very savvy politically, very well organized, property-owning, income distributing political party in Lebanon.
With a social service infrastructure,
no
et cetera,
question
et cetera. Yeah.
about it. Before I go with that, just one thing on the Christmas polling, because I think you're right, the administration tried to laugh it off. When you look at it, and if, like me, you have a lot of friends coming from Europe who are put through increasing humiliation just to come and say, teach a course at this university or in this town, all the time, here's a guy, a Nigerian, who's just been banned from Britain by the government for terrorist association, some weeks before, whose father has gone to the American embassy in Nigeria, in Lagos, to say, I think my son's gone rogue somewhere in Yemen. It's probably this Solauki guy who you keep on about, who weeks before had done this, who nonetheless manages to board a flight to the United States, paying in cash for a one-way ticket, and without being searched. I think that is very serious. What you need is for that to happen, to be found to have happened with the next person who manages to kill a lot of people.
Right.
And then there will be anger, and I will be part of it. And I won't take any Department of Homeland Security secretary, whatever her name is, saying he was just proving the system worked. Not even if it's Boxing Day, I'm not going to do that. So, now I think I was at a Hezbollah rally not long ago in southern Beirut. I don't recommend it as a recreational experience, but it does demonstrate a very, very impressive degree of organization. And I couldn't help noticing the new party symbol on the flag and on the banners is a nuclear mushroom cloud. Now, and when you look at it closer, the cloud is made out of Arabic characters. I suppose in Iran it would be made out of Persian characters, in this case Arabic, which carries a message to the infinitely despised Jewish people. I wouldn't want to look back later and think, maybe I should have seen that warning. I think one's entitled to take a thing like that seriously. I think, in fact, one's morally obliged to do so. And just as I think in negotiations with Hamas, for example, It's too much to ask for any party in the Middle East that they adopt a pacifist stand and give up forswear violence. But I don't think it's too much to ask Hamas to give up the protocols of the Elders of Zion as part of their party manifesto. I think that's something the UN can, and its Anti-Racism Commission, in fact, the meeting this week, can become seized of. That is a war-making racist incitement. It's banned by every document of the UN and has a very rank history. And just as we were within our rights to suggest to the PLO that it amended its charter some years ago, that's something that you can test. You can say, will you do that or won't you? Because if you won't, it must mean a lot to you, given what you could get by repudiating it. So I think it's a split decision on Iran. I think there are millenarian forces around Ahmadinejad in particular who do think that the hidden Imam, the Mahdi, will come back in their lifetime and are making preparations for it. They don't say it would be the progress of his wonderful refulgent return would be advanced by a nuclear war, but they don't say it wouldn't either.
So, I mean,
but for the most part, I'm sure I know what they want the nukes for. Not to have a war with Israel either, because that would be the last thing they ever did, literally. Maybe down the road, but they don't want to immolate themselves. They run a very comfortable, very, very lucrative racket, mullahs. In Iran, I've seen it. They run everything from the brothels to the natural gas to the taxi drivers, and they don't want to give it up. What they do want is strategic ambiguity and the possibility of blackmail of their Sunni neighbors, in particular Bahrain, which is very noticeable now in the Iranian right-wing press. They've resumed the chant that Bahrain is really Iranian. It's their Kuwait. And one day they move into some neighboring Arab Sunni state with oil and say, well, we're in there, our troops are here, we have a nuclear weapon, what do you want to do about it?
So reading between the lines of what you're saying, to get back down to brass tacks, assuming that sanctions and diplomacy, if there is we ever even have any real diplomacy, get to a point where don't prove any more successful than they seem now, and Iran gets closer, and we surely would have the view that our military attack would be more successful than Israel's, then are you saying go for it at that point?
That it should be ourselves or Israel who should do it?
That at the end of the day, if we assume that, that sanctions are not going to work and that diplomacy is never going to get you anywhere, that at the end of the day, that Obama should do what Bush was unwilling to do, which was to take action, to take a military strike?
Well, since you asked me directly, at different times, each of us on this platform favored the overthrow of the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. And for different lengths of time, as I remember. But for quite similar reasons. As a sine qua non, there can't be any real, nothing can happen in Iraq while it remains the property of a psychopathic crime family. And that wasn't just a moral statement, it had other implications too. All of them, I think, by the way, correct. It didn't work out as well as any of us had hoped. It worked out much worse than any of us had feared. In analyzing this, because it does, like everything else, has to be subjected to an analysis, which of us wouldn't say that the job would have been better done in 1992? That the worst part of the Iraqi experience was the 10 years plus of Saddam plus sanctions, immiseration of the country, terrible suffering of the population, destruction of its internal infrastructure, all the things that make it nearly ungovernable now. Getting rid of Saddam would have been better done earlier, after he'd attempted, well, had in fact succeeded in abolishing a member state of the United Nations, than afterwards. Well, certainly that's what I think. Well, I don't know how far the analogy could extend, but if there is going to be a confrontation with Iran, and I think there is going to be one because I think that's what they want, then I would...
They meaning the Iranians.
Sorry?
They meaning the Iranians.
With the Iranians, with the Iranian theocracy, with the Revolutionary Guard dictatorship within the dictatorship, and its nuclear covert wing, I think three. The time of that should be decided not by them. The pretext for it should be decided not by them. And it would be better done when they're not ready than when they are. That would be my strong view. It's a muted applause. Thank you, comrade.
It's a striking comment partly because, George, the conventional wisdom in Washington is that the Israelis might or might not, but that America almost certainly won't, whether that's right or not. But the conventional wisdom is that there's no appetite for this inside the Obama administration. I wonder if you think that's right, and then also just to pose the same question to Christopher. Do you think the consequences of, let's take the worst case scenario, that none of these efforts short of war get you anywhere, that at the end of the day, military action is preferable to living with the Iranian nuclear bomb?
Well, first, on Iraq, I have to say, I never regretted the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. I regretted the consequences, especially the avoidable ones. And Iraq does raise some pretty tough questions for anyone proposing conflict with Iran. Whether it's in 92 or 2003, basically, we don't know the consequences, but we do know that they will be, to a large degree, out of our control. That is the nature of war, and if I didn't know it before 2003, I certainly learned it on repeated trips to Iraq after 2003. We didn't know what the Iraqi people felt because they were in an absolutely sealed prison. It was almost impossible to gauge Iraqi public opinion. We knew what some exiles were saying, and some of them were rather persuasive, but we didn't know what the Iraqi... We have much more of a sense of what the Iranian public thinks about an American war in Iran, and it's basically overwhelmingly against it. And I think one reason is it would set back the democratic movement in Iran by decades. It would not overthrow the regime. We don't have it in our capacity to overthrow the regime. Only the Iranians can do that, and they wouldn't be able to do it because they're not in a position to. So politically, I think it would be an absolute disaster for the forces of democratic reform inside Iran, which are still there, even though they've been pretty badly beaten down and imprisoned and driven into exile. They're still there, and they remain the single most hopeful force in the Middle East. That is the one place where you can say the public is basically more pro-Western than the regime, wants democracy, maybe even liberal democracy. They've been driven by 30 years of theocracy to a position that's not that far from what everyone on this stage believes in. Do we want to take the chance that we're going to set that back by decades when, if left alone, it might have a chance, maybe not next year, but maybe in 5 years, of undermining the regime at home? So that's my top question. Anyone who's proposing war has to answer to the Iranians, especially to the young and very brave journalists and activists who are either in prison or in hiding or out of the country, but who, all those I've talked to, and I've talked to a lot of them, are unanimous against an American strike. So there are other strategic questions, especially having to do with the region, Sunni Arabs, and our own interests. I don't know that the Revolutionary Guard want a confrontation with the U.S. I think they want to walk up to that line, but not cross it. If they wanted a confrontation... The
line meaning the nuclear threshold, or the line meaning war?
War. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of things they could be doing right now, way beyond the cat and mouse game with the nuclear program, that they're not doing, because I actually think their own sense of their survival is the strongest motive. I might be wrong. I might be wrong, because as I said, we really don't know what goes on at the heart of that regime. But their behavior to me suggests they want to antagonize the U.S., they want to try to divide the world against the U.S. They certainly want to use Israel as to whip up the Arab street and turn Iran into the unlikely champion of Sunni Arabs. But I don't think they want a war.
So, Christopher, how do you answer that? That this could be if not the death, a grave setback to the Green Revolution that you care so much about?
Yes, and like George, I have a lot of friends in Iran and outside it now, alas, in the diaspora, who have a lot of the same misgivings. They're not as unanimous in saying that they're opposed to a strike, though, for two reasons. One, a lot of them understand very plainly, and even some of the more moderate leaders of the Green movement have been heard to say it, those who lost the so-called election, for example, that they understand it's part of the reason for the isolation of their country, for its bankruptcy, its backwardness, the absence of cultural exchange and trade, and the preeminence of repression and thuggery is precisely the nuclear program. And they see that it's a feature, a very important feature of the dictatorship, especially of the Revolutionary Guards, who are their immediate oppressors. So much though they might like to separate it, they can't do it as easily as George just did. I mean, there it is. Second, let's put the case that we had absolutely smoking gun evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Suppose we had that. And we also knew that everyone in Iraq, including all the Kurds, was completely against the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. What would our position have been? International law says the regime goes. It's been found out, breaking all of its obligations under every single resolution. We're licensed to remove the government, even if it's the most popular government in the region. That's too bad. Its public opinion doesn't entitle it to be an aggressive, illegal, nuclear-armed dictatorship. That's a pity, but there it is. That's how I think we'd have to reason it. I don't think we can subcontract this to the Israelis for a number of reasons. And I'd want to say, as by way of preface, something that I keep on saying because when I can, and so I'll say it now, there's something not unlike a racist lacuna in this whole discussion when Netanyahu and others describe the Iranian nuclear weapons as a threat to the Jewish people or the Jewish state, which they certainly are, and very explicitly often, and in genocidal and exterminationist terms, are flourished in that way. No one ever points out, or isn't pointed out enough, that any use of such weapons in Jerusalem, Palestine, the greater Israel area, would kill all the Palestinians too.
And potentially deface the Dome of the Rock.
And
isn't that an argument?
Say nothing about the Al-Aqsa.
But isn't that an argument for why, in fact, they might not use it?
Well, I was about to say it's a very good argument for the Israelis to have a Palestinian state with its capital in half of Jerusalem. Because among other things, as well as a matter of principle, long overdue, it would be a security guarantee. The person who used genocidal weapons in that region would be destroying the Palestinian homeland. Not just a place where Palestinians are now treated as if they shouldn't have been born there and are an inconvenience to another demographic project, which is that I don't think at this stage of the evening we can open that one completely, but it also means I think there's something unbalanced about leaving this to the Likud party and its political and religious allies in Israel. I don't think we can decently do that, and I don't think anyone in the Muslim world at any rate would for a moment believe that Israel had in fact acted unilaterally. They would have to believe they were acting as deputy Satan, as they do already. So we would gain nothing by this moral and political cowardice.
Yeah. George, you were just in Israel, and in terms of domestic politics, that's one of the hottest aspects of Obama's foreign policy. Again, on this theme of what we think Obama really believes versus what he says. There is a strong sense in Israel, some in Israel, and in the organized American Jewish community, that Obama doesn't feel the same sense of affinity, connection to Israel that do past Republican Democratic presidents, and perhaps even that he takes the view that was uttered kind of by David Petraeus, that Israel might be in some senses a strategic liability to the United States, something whispered about in foreign policy circles, but not sometimes. Do you think that's true? And how would you assess his Israel policy so far?
Do I think Israelis think that, or do I think he really is?
Do you think he really does have a different vision of the U.S.-Israel relationship than the one in which he would be happy to put more distance than past American presidents? At least the last two, let's say the last two American presidents.
Well, he's obviously closer to Clinton than to Bush. I mean, Bush essentially said to the Israelis, whatever you want to do, we're behind you. And that was, I think, a pretty bad policy toward Israel, a terrible one, in fact, because what Israel was doing was not necessarily even in Israel's interest, let alone in our interest. In fact, I think it wasn't in Israel's interest. So it wouldn't be a bad thing if Obama steered away to some degree from the unconditional support that Bush gave. But I think we're talking about really small degrees of difference that are magnified in Israel because the anxiety level, in the sense of, I mean, you really have to go there to realize how much people feel that their own existence in Israel is constantly in question, that they don't necessarily have any future. And that is not necessarily the most cool-headed way to gauge threats and interests. For example, Iran is regarded by the people. And by the way, I was not talking to government officials, and I wasn't talking to too many settlers, a few. I was mainly talking to David Grossman, who represents about 0.001% of the Israeli public, because he's been a champion of the Palestinian state for decades and still thinks that the onus is basically on Israel to make the overtures that would lead to that. But what I heard from others than David Grossman was that Iran is this implacable foe and war with Iran is inevitable. It was not even really a question. Of course it's going to happen. The notion of an internal opposition in Iran, which might factor into their calculations, was like a nice little human interest story I was telling them that had nothing to do with the basic issues that Israel was confronting. So it was, let's say, an unnuanced view of their own position and of Iran, and that was pretty worrying, I would say. So no, I don't think Obama has abandoned Israel, not a bit. In fact, if anything, David Grossman, I think, had the right view, which was that Obama is capable of seeing the conflict through the point of view of both sides. And that is essential if there's going to be any American role in bringing about a peace. I think that Grossman had Obama read correctly in that way, but it's, as I said, it's a minority view in Israel.
I ducked your question to me. You asked me a direct one, and I seemed to refuse it a moment ago.
About military action against Iran?
No, you said, would the thought that it would kill so many Palestinians not deter Iran from, the mullahs from doing so? No. I mean, we know this already. If you ask Hamas, another of Iran's proxies in the region, and another reason why by the way, why the prospect of a Palestinian state is receding, if you ask them what do they say about the Palestinian bystanders who they kill, who are quite numerous, in Gaza, and also when they fire rockets into Israel and into the coastal towns, they very often kill non-Jews. They say, that's fine, if God will know. If they're good Muslims, they've gone straight to paradise. God knows his own. They've already thought about that. It's a borrowing from the filth of medieval Christianity, from Pope Innocent III, and the other saying, kill them all. God will know.
God will sort it out.
This is why some of us don't believe that religion. Why some of us don't believe that religion is a benign force in human affairs. Now, whether you could actually get the Ayatollahs to issue a fatwa of that kind in advance about the number of Palestinian deaths and holy sites desecrated that would be involved in this, I don't know. But they are, believe me, they are thinking about it in Qom now, how they would phrase that. That is the mentality that we are up against, whether people wish it were true or not, by the way.
George, we've been doing more on Iran than Afghanistan, but I wanted to go back to Afghanistan for a minute. Where do you think we will be in terms of American Afghanistan policy? Let's assume that President Obama wins re-election. I happen to think he will, but where do you think we will be when he wakes up to give his second inaugural? Where do you think we'll be in 2013? Do you think we'll be deeper in, or do you think we'll have begun the process of getting out?
That is a really hard one to answer. If it were up to Obama, I think in his fondest wishes, he would essentially be giving the speech he just gave about Iraq, which, by the way, was, by his standards, a very dishonest speech, in which he announced the end of combat operations. A week later, Americans were getting killed in Iraq, in which he said, we've discharged all of our responsibilities to Iraq. That is a woefully inaccurate statement, in which he said that the time is right. No, it isn't. Iraq doesn't have a functioning government right now, 7 months after an election, et cetera, et cetera. And Iraqis themselves are extremely, who now can express their opinion, thanks to the overthrow of Saddam, are extremely anxious about an Iraq without American soldiers in the streets or on bases. So it wasn't worthy of him to fudge it, given that he bears so little responsibility for what went. None. I mean, he was right. I think he saw it more clearly than most, but now that he's president, he can't speak about it clearly. On Afghanistan, I think it's exactly the same. My sense is, and I'm sure this is in Bob Woodward's book, but I don't need to read his book to know it, that Obama does not want to be there, does not have a lot of faith in counterinsurgency, which is the strategy that he's pinned everything on now, that he is afraid of losing his base on this, that he's afraid of his presidency being sunk. I mean, they were talking about LBJ within the first weeks of his arrival in the White House. That was the shadow hanging over the White House, was will this war destroy his domestic reform ideas, which didn't take the war, it just took, 40 Republican senators.
But then why on earth did he agree last summer, during last year, to send more U.S. troops into Afghanistan and then to put David Petraeus in charge of the mission, given that this is the man absolutely associated with a counterinsurgency strategy that's going to take a long time?
Well, that's the contradiction at the heart of Obama's approach and of the whole strategy. I mean, everything about this war has become confused and contradictory. Why are we there? We're there to fight al-Qaeda. What does fighting al-Qaeda have to do with building up a police force in Marja? Well, you could make a case, but it would be a very long, elaborate one, and it wouldn't convince very many people. And along the way, you would lose the public. So instead, we have to keep insisting that we're there to fight al-Qaeda, when in fact, that doesn't have a lot to do with the ordinary experience of American soldiers in Afghanistan. We're not nation building, but at the same time, we're putting a tremendous amount of emphasis on corruption, because we know that corruption is at the heart of the reason why the Taliban has made a resurgence in so many parts of Afghanistan. And yet, on the other hand, we're allowing Karzai to kind of get away with it because we don't want to challenge him too much because we're afraid of the backlash from him. Just in every way, it's at loggerheads with itself. And I think last fall, Obama tried to rope in the military to an exit strategy by, according to Jonathan Alter's book, making Petraeus and Mullen and Gates sign off on July 2011 as a significant date. Immediately that date began to disappear in a cloud of vapor. What does it mean? How many troops? It meant different things to different people. To have that much uncertainty hanging over such a key strategic question suggests that the administration has not resolved the question that you're asking, and that's why I can't really answer it. I don't know, because I don't think they know.
But not just the president alone, but I would say the strategic majority of the Democratic Party leadership under George Bush made this rod in public for their own back. They all said, and they thought it was clever, the Iraq war bad, Afghanistan war very good. They elaborated it. It wasn't enough. They could see the pit they were digging for themselves. They had to make it worse, Obama particularly. He said, war of choice, not war of necessity, was Iraq. The necessary war is Afghanistan. And he made that speech either to the veterans of foreign wars or to the cadets at West Point, I forget, but some audience where you better mean what you say, at any rate. Wasn't some nothing fundraiser. And it's quite a revelation to find from Woodward's book that he didn't mean a word even of that that was just to get him through the campaign and placate his base. This is pretty shabby.
You know,
So you ask how bad is it going to get? Much worse is my answer.
I was going to just add, I was there twice last year, and the second time was just before the election. I think the election that Karzai stole a month or two after Ahmadinejad stole one just to the west, which is why they were so happy to embrace each other when they met in Kabul. That was a turning point, and I actually thought that Obama should have done what he did in the fall, and now I think it's not going to succeed. It's a strategy that's doomed to fail, and part of it's because of the reporting of my friend Dexter Filkins, who's sitting in the front row. I mean, if you read Dexter's work in the Times and that of his colleagues, you cannot see how this is going to happen, because essentially Karzai, as an American ambassador who had experience in Vietnam with the same problem, said to me, Karzai has the strength of his weakness. He can essentially blackmail us, and we're stuck with him. And how do you begin to reform a government and an economy, which is at the heart of counterinsurgency, when your partner is as rotten to the core as the Afghan government? There is no way through it that I can see.
And also in a country, the travails of which are, in my opinion, my reading of it, largely a function of a bigger thing, which is the ongoing decomposition of Pakistan as a state. I mean, the Taliban were originally Pakistan's colonial nominees to take over Afghanistan, to give them strategic depth in the war with India over Kashmir. So it begins as a metastasis of what is, I think, since 1947-48, partly a failed and partly a rogue state. Now it's much more of both, except it has nuclear weapons. And has us by the genitalia. That's why I began by saying, I'm glad I got it in early, because I'll be able to return to it. It is absolutely crucial that we make India our crucial ally in the region and not Pakistan. This will involve us in a negotiation that we have criminally and shamefully neglected for a long time, which is to interest ourselves in the possibility of an autonomy solution for Kashmir, which is India's great shortcoming politically, but is also, alas, part of its guarantee as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. But there's a real future in building a relationship with India. There's no future at all in building a relationship with the Pakistani ISI and their clients.
You know,
that's doomed to start with.
Afghanistan has gone so badly that Pakistan has actually been the good news story for the administration. The army has taken on its own homegrown Taliban in Swat and in South Waziristan, et cetera, et cetera. We have a new aid package, which seems to show the Pakistanis are bona fides. It's focused on long-term development, et cetera. Two problems. One, the floods of the Indus River have displaced 20 million people. I mean, for some reason, this is not caught on as a Haiti-like. Haiti caught on much more than this, maybe because it's so far away. But it's a disaster of just unimaginable proportions, and it's going to change the politics, economics of that country for years and years. And second, as Dex's reporting showed, they may have decided their own Taliban were a threat, but they remain committed to the Afghan Taliban, to the point where, in a Filkins piece, turns out a whole string of arrests of high-level Taliban by the Pakistanis were not part of the war on terror or the war on the Taliban. They were Pakistan telling its proxy, the Afghan Taliban, you don't negotiate with Karzai without us. We're going to lock you up for a little while to teach you who's boss here. We're running you, not the other way around. So that is the Pakistan's truly warped idea of its own strategic interests is the heart of the problem in the region, and to change that is the business of decades of effort. And
in the short time that we have left, I wanted to step back for a minute on this theme of things that Obama may believe but doesn't want to publicly say for domestic political reasons, Christopher. And I think one of the things that's just shadowing the whole foreign policy debate a great deal in the domestic political debate is the question of whether the president really believes that American power is in decline. And that one of the reasons we may have to live with things that we don't like is that we don't get to dictate things in the way that we once thought we could. And I wonder if you think that's true of the people making Obama's foreign policy, that they are essentially trying to deal with a world in which they think that American power is never going to go back to where it was, even say in the 1990s, or where we thought it was, and whether in fact you think that's an accurate depiction of the reality we live in.
I'm sorry.
Yes, I think it's subconsciously at least true of a lot of his advisors and of himself. I'm not sure it's true of his Secretary of State. And I'm not sure that he's fully thought it out, as a lot of people haven't, who wished for a less imperial America, but didn't think of the implications of there being another superpower that was stronger than it. That's not seeming very likely at the end of the Cold War period. Now, I think that thought has, or ought to have by now, a bit evolved when one considers the rise of a very self-confident and aggressive Russia, for example. Putin managing to fuse both the tactics of the KGB and the relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church that the Tsars had before Stalin into a nasty, xenophobic, clerical, chauvinist regime, militarized and police-run. and increasingly aggressive on its borders, very close to Western Europe. Or to a China, which, for example, you mentioned sanctions several times this evening, rightly in the case of Iran. But every time anyone tries to do anything, and it's usually on the initiative of the United States, about Burma, about Darfur, Zimbabwe, North Korea, any of these things, the Chinese are always there, the UN, to block it. Not always, but usually with Russian help. So a good long look at what a world where another superpower be calling the shots would look like, I think might be very salutary. And I think there's a slight tendency at the moment to look away from that.
Just ask the question to you. Do you think that the people making Obama foreign policy believe that they're having to manage American decline?
I think probably they do. I don't know it for sure. They're not going to say it publicly or to me. I think you're right that Hillary Clinton, she gave a speech at the Council on Foreign Relations the other day that suggested that we're living in 1947. All we need to do is make a whole new architecture of national security and we will once again lead the world. And I'd like to believe it's true for the same reasons that Christopher just said. But actually, the national security strategy document that they released a few months ago, the key to it was essentially we cannot lead abroad if our economy and our society are in decline. Our economy and our society are unquestionably in decline. And history shows that a world power does not maintain its level of power abroad when its people are not graduating from college, and when its high-speed rail would be laughable in just about any other country, and et cetera, and when its political opposition, and I get back to what I alluded to at the start, when its political opposition is so irresponsible that even as common sense a treaty as the nuclear reduction treaty with Russia could be filibustered for the sake of blocking an Obama initiative, and only for that reason. There are dysfunctions at home that make whatever our position on India, Iran, et cetera, almost tangential. And I think Obama's right to realize that the eclipse of our own politics and economics is a threat to our leadership in the world. And unfortunately, he's governing at a time of a kind of political irrationality that doesn't see the long term in that way. And I think he's unfortunate in the period in which he came to power. I think he might have been a better president at another time, but he doesn't speak the language that people seem to want to hear these days.
Well, this hasn't been a cheery discussion, but it's been a very honest one, and I think for that I feel grateful, and I hope you feel grateful. Thank you very, very much for coming.